It was a beautiful Weimaraner that Frank has had since childhood. His name is Drogo, I think. He appears and disappears from the house. Sometimes I never see him at all. Frank grabbed him by the collar and dragged him into the kitchen, then locked the door. It looked remarkably difficult as the dog struggled and yelped to break free, but eventually yielded to him. We could still hear scratching from the other side of the door. Frank asked X if the egg was okay. He nodded profusely. X said that it was time to move the egg into a safer place. Frank motioned to me, inviting me to his bedroom, but I declined. Somehow 2 hours had passed since I had come to the house and it was time for my next class. I wasn't really thinking of assisting, but I didn't want to stay there, either. I felt like I was intruding. So I said my goodbyes, picked up my bag and walked out the front gate smoking a cigarette. I've picked up the habit from Brett, by the way. I really wish I hadn't, but it's comforting when you're standing in the middle of the street and have absolutely nothing to do. I had to walk down the winding streets and pass by many joggers and dog walkers, looking at me with mild curiosity and disapproval, until I got to the bus stop. I felt a little numb and strange, as if everything had ceased to move for a moment. It might have been the cigarettes, I'm not very used to them yet. It felt like a resigned calm, not necessarily good. Like a kind of fatalism in the face of death. I sat waiting for the bus and strangely felt like crying. I didn't go to class that day. I think that I've been dealing with depression for a long time now. Have you ever taken a long bus ride without a destination? Any city with a public transport system is perfect for that. Empty bus seats at night are the most heartbreaking thing. It had become a bit of a hobby for me to simply sit there and watch neighborhood blocks, projects, skyscrapers go by. It's becoming progressively easier for me to enter a state of complete disconnect from the world and its troubles. I have a perfect understanding of my pressing responsibilities, upcoming assignments, family expectations and so on. But I survey them with a gray cloud in my mind. It's like I'm in a fog. Lately this winter I've been waking up early in the morning to sit on the wet grass outside my room and watch the still world. I went to Frank's house in this state of mind. The house is beautiful in its decay. It's so out of the beaten path, along a deserted street with abandoned lots, running down the steepest hill of District 5. The black iron gate at the entrance has ivy wrapped around it. It looks like a European haunted manor. The guard acknowledged my presence quietly and I pushed the gate open. I had missed class again. Earlier that week I had already informed my boss that I would be quitting at the end of the month. I was just an intern, anyway. I would eventually be able to find work somewhere. He looked at me sternly and said he was disappointed. I don't think I was very good at my job. As I walked along the winding garden path of Frank's front door I felt a tingling in my legs and an odd sweetness in the back of my mouth. It was a kind of anxiety. He opened the door just as I was about to knock. He looked like he hadn't slept. We talked about inconsequential things for a little while and he played with his hair. But the moment we sat in the old living room, with the dusty record player and the spider-covered bookshelves, he broke down. Just sobbing. I had never seen him like that. I actually didn't know to react for the first few minutes. I just sat across from him and quietly sipped the coffee he had brought me. I looked around nervously to see if his father would show up, or maybe X, but the house seemed to be empty except for us. Eventually I asked him to calm down, but it came out muffled. He stopped crying eventually and explained to me what had happened earlier that morning. He had woken up to find that X had disappeared. Most of his things were gone with him, but some clothes remained scattered on the floor of the guest room. The bed where he slept had been somehow flipped over and was now leaning against the wall, as if thrown by a powerful wind. Frank said that he hadn't heard any strange noises the night before. Then he led me to patio in the back. I trailed a few steps behind, trying to process everything. As he swung the kitchen door open a powerful odor hit me. It was decomposition. In the middle of the patio was Drogo, Frank's dog. A pigeon was trying to pluck out its left eye. I instinctively stepped out and scared the bird away. I had gotten used to the smell remarkably quickly. Drogo hadn't been dead for a very long time. I surveyed the slender, gray body. There were no visible wounds. I turned back to Frank, who looked mortified. He said he had discovered the body earlier this morning. He hadn't the heart to move it. I asked him if anything else was missing. He replied that the egg was gone. I just stared in disbelief at what he was suggesting. After the initial shock, we took a walk around the yard and surveyed the gate, the walls, the back door. No locks had been broken and there were no signs of forced entry. Frank's father has a guard standing outside his house at all times of night and early morning. It doesn't seem possible that someone would be able to sneak in without anyone noticing. We wondered for about an hour, looking for an explanation. He mentioned that he hadn't told anyone other than me. He knew he would eventually have to tell the rest of the group, but right now he wanted help with something else. He wanted me to help him cremate Drogo. The proposal seemed a little morbid, and I shuddered at the thought of touching the body. But Frank seemed so distraught that I couldn't possibly say no. I knew that I wouldn't go to my next class, I was already failing half my courses, anyway. So I agreed. We did our best to do everything respectfully. The body was extremely heavy, so we had to use the rusted wheelbarrow left in a corner of the yard. Eventually we managed to stuff the body in the furnace. Frank shut the door with resolve and started the fire. Had Frank lived anywhere closer to urbanization than he did, I'm sure we would have gotten a dozen complaints from the smell and the smoke. It was thick and black, impenetrable. I shielded my eyes and covered my nose but still stared up in the sky, a dull gray color, at the smoke column. Frank was silent next to me. It burned and burned for an hour. We didn't say much of anything. After it was over, Frank thanked me and asked if I wanted to stay. I was feeling strange about the whole thing, though. I said I had to go to class and showed myself out. He stood on the patio, where Drogo's body had been, and stared. I shut the gate behind me. My clothes stunk of smoke. Then it suddenly hit me, that X was missing, that someone had almost certainly broken into Frank's house last night, that Frank was probably in danger. I considered calling X's parents until I realized that I didn't have their number and I didn't know where he lived. I considered calling Frank and telling him to go to a hotel for at least a week. But the moment I got to my house I felt an overwhelming malaise and collapsed in my bed. I don't recall any dreams. I woke up at midnight, having slept 12 hours. The only light in my room came from my sis, from Brad, Frank, Erica, Aaron, and Nathan. They were all recounting the same thing, of course. X's body had washed up on the shore. Sometimes I would rise at 3 a.m. and slowly pour myself a long glass of water, feeling the absence of others in every room of the house, savoring the creaks of the stairwell, breathing the dust, and I would see my face reflected on the panes of the kitchen drawers as I poured myself the glass, and I would ask to the silence, "Who are you?" Sometimes I would be driving home from campus in the beat-up, discount Volvo and there would be a long counting red streetlight where I wanted there to be none, and in those 120 or so seconds sitting in traffic I would go over the events of the day, the minutiae and the banal commentary, and I would find myself gripping the steering wheel as if I were afraid it's made of gas and my hands were going to pass straight through it, like an illusion, and I would concentrate on this, on feeling an object occupy physical space, as a manner of reassurance. Years later I would realize that a rather deep and sharp dent on the northeastern side of the wheel was the place where I always dug in with the nail of my thumb in these times. Sometimes I would finally feel consumed, as if the world could no longer gnaw at anything because there wasn't anything left, and in these times especially smoking gave me headaches and all my limbs felt sore, and I would sleep for 10 or 12 hours at a time, starting in the early afternoon and rising, completely disoriented, at around midnight, only to undress and turn off the record player and go back to bed. This was the worst winter of my life and Brad knew it well. Whenever I had the energy we would drive aimlessly through the neighborhoods around campus and stop for cigarettes and beers, walking around in the magic hour, when sunlight is distilled in rushes between buildings, through clotheslines, permeating cars and apartments. That was a relatively light time for Brad, whose taste in music had softened. He was listening to the Cocteau Twins and Mazzy Star, appropriate for our 5 to 7 drives around the district. He was coasting on easy courses and going to concerts and seeing new people while I was completely withdrawn. The most active thing we did together was drive or play cards. I barely had the energy for conversation, which meant that few people could tolerate me aside from Brad. That was shortly after my fight with Aaron and my distancing from me, so we weren't going out much as a group. I remember Brad tried to rope you into our excursions, but you were too busy pretending to be interested in your career. Back then I knew that I needed help, and you did as well. We had both become so empty that people didn't recognize us anymore. My dad never showed concern, but your parents did. Back when we were in school I would often have dinner at your house and we would have lively conversations about the war on the news. But in those later, pathetic years, your parents only rang me up to try and find out what was wrong with you. They weren't aware that by then we almost weren't speaking. But standing on the yard of my house on a sunlight morning, curling the phone cord around my hand, talking to your mom about when we were kids, was a blessing anyway, even though she sounded so sad. I don't know what happened to us. All our forward momentum evaporated the second our graduation ceremony ended. Once you told me that it had been the night at the hotel that did it, that it had been too much for us. And maybe it contributed, but I think it goes beyond that. We had so much going for us and so many people cheering us on back in school. I was going to be a painter and a writer and a sculptor. You were going to be an athlete and a dancer and a chemist. And I don't even understand where the next 7 years went. Apparently they slipped past me while I was sitting on the lawn chair outside, throwing cigarette butts into the empty pool. I remember specific events of nights out drinking, parties we regretted going to, people we dated, excursions, lazy afternoons with the group, but on a macro level, I have no idea of what I was doing. I was too crushed to consider it. I'm sorry for meandering. It was back in this winter when I was useless and Brad had more or less become my caregiver, that we shared all our deeper anxieties about the future. As was the case for everyone in our group, we were secretly unsure of everything, our talents, interests, decisions, priorities, affections. Later on it became apparent that every one of us regretted whatever we had studied in university, but at that time it was just Brad and I, commiserating. We would talk about a lot of things on the hood of his car on those afternoons, and we would talk about weird shit as well. The term seemed so childish at that point, something we had come up with as teenagers and kept going far past its sell-by date. We talked about Monica and Sister Zero, about all the record stores. It was our way of disarming the strangeness of their existence and distancing them from our lives. If you will recall, nothing out of the ordinary had happened to us for the better part of a year. It had become apparent, at least to me, that things didn't simply happen to us. We sought them out for entertainment, and the moment we stopped being interested, they disintegrated from life and memory. All that remained were specters of shared childhood dreams. They no longer seemed even real. And we talked them all away, explained them rationally in dozens of different ways. Whenever our individual versions of the same story differed, we took it as proof that the whole thing was a fabrication. One Wednesday we had skipped our last classes of the afternoon and headed straight for the bodega to drink, and we were probably 4 bottles deep when our conversation began to extend beyond its natural point, the point where we would normally head home. We had started early and were going on late, the street lights were already on, and the place was empty except for us. Having no more customers, Omar had headed to the back room to watch TV with his girlfriend. We were sitting at the white plastic table right at the entrance with a stray cat for company. The soda cooler was buzzing in the background, and that was it. It was perfect. I knew that something was going to happen because Brad had gone silent in a way that was unusual for him. Considering that Brad is a man with a severely limited expressive range, you learn to read even the most minor facial cues for indications. And I could read the doubt that comes with struggling to spit something out, something that you have already decided that you will say, but is so deeply buried and unthinkable that physically formulating the words feels like trying to remember a language you haven't spoken in decades. It took him a while, but he did it. This story takes place at a vague point between Monica and Xochipilli. Surely you are familiar with those terms by now. Brad must have told you everything about his childhood. In those times summers were longer and we were all in grade school. You and I, now that I think about it, were not even friends. You orbited around Brad and I orbited around A. And when those two became best friends, that was how we met. So I guess it makes sense that I wouldn't have known of this until now. Brad's parents were not financially stable, and there were a couple times when they almost had to pull him out of school. His dad was a journalist and I think his mom had to go back to teaching a few times to make ends meet. For a few months they had a plastic table in the kitchen. Brad never had video game consoles or BMX bicycles. He sold weed to afford records. Remember the coat of many pockets? He shared a room with his little brother right up until he moved out of the house. Really, out of university, things surely would have been difficult for me. When I was a kid I didn't notice these things, or at least I didn't really let myself think about them. But with time I began to feel guilt over the stark differences of our economic situations. But this isn't about me, anyway. Brad's dad was a member of the Klan from the start. I understand that the Klan didn't really take off locally until the mid-80s, when there was an influx of important people who joined.